Hello, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to the New York Public Library. My name is Martha Hodes. I'm serving as interim director of the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers. Let me just make a few points before we begin our program. Please be aware that our program is being recorded tonight. For those of you here with us in the Burger Forum, we do recommend and encourage you to wear a mask. If you don't have a mask and you would like one, feel free to just raise your hand and someone will come around and give you one. For our virtual attenders, thank you so much for being with us. Real-time captions are available by clicking on the closed caption button. If you would like a live transcript, use the stream text link shared in the reminder email or chat. Well, this evening, we begin our 2023 lineup of conversations from the Cullman Center, presenting Cullman Fellow Hanna Pylväinen. Speaking about her new novel, she will be speaking with us about her new novel, The End of Drum Time, with novelist Julia Phillips. Why not? If you have an NYPL library card, or if you live in New York State and want to apply for one, you can borrow The End of Drum Time for free. You can also buy the book from our library shop, where proceeds benefit the library. You can find links to buy the book on our event page, nypl.org/conversations. Or best of all, you can buy the book and have it signed by Hanna right outside the Burger Forum here after the program this evening. Please, guests, make yourselves at home. Yes. Let me just say a few words about the Cullman Center. We select 15 fellows each year who come to the library to use our unparalleled collections in order to write the books of tomorrow. Our fellows are among the best and most promising: academics and independent scholars, fiction writers and poets, journalists, translators, playwrights, and artists at work today. Writers and scholars from any country are welcome to apply, and the next cycle of applications will be available on our website in June, so do have a look. Let me also add that you can see everything the library has to offer by signing up for our newsletter at nypl.org/connect. All programs are made possible by donations from our patrons, so do consider supporting the library however you can. And now to this evening's program. Our speakers will converse for 35 or 40 minutes, and then we'll take your questions. For those of you here with us, please use the cards and pencils that you find on the chairs, and program staff will be collecting those cards just shortly before Q&A. If you're joining us online and would like to ask a question, please share that question either in the chat or by emailing cullmancenter@nypl.org. And now to our distinguished guests, both of whom write fiction that takes place in remote regions of the world. Hanna's interlocutor this evening is Julia Phillips, whose debut novel, Disappearing Earth, was selected as a New York Times 10 Best Books of the Year and was a National Book Award finalist and an international bestseller. Julia has written for the New York Times, The Atlantic, and the Paris Review, and is the founder of Lit Mixer, a monthly online series of conversations about the craft of writing and the ins and outs of publishing. Julia speaks tonight with Hanna Pylväinen, author of the prize-winning novel, We Sinners. Hanna's writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Harper's, among other venues. And she's the recipient of fellowships from, among others, MacDowell, Yaddo, Princeton University's Lewis Center for the Arts, and the American Scandinavian Foundation. Hanna is currently on the faculty at the Warren Wilson College MFA program for writers. At the Cullman Center in 2021, she was the Rona Jaffe Foundation Fellow. Well, today is the official publication date of The End of Drum Time, set in the Arctic Circle in the mid-19th century. Elle magazine has already called the book a monumental feat of melodic prose and astute observation, powerful and awe-inspiring. The starred review in Kirkus calls it captivating, immersive, transcendent. Wow. Please join me in a very warm welcome for Julia Phillips and Hanna Pylväinen.
Martha, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to be echoing all that praise and trying to build on it even, because this is truly a magnificent book, a magnificent accomplishment, and it is such an honor for all of us, I think, to get to be with you, celebrating the end of Drum Time on the day it's published. This is an honor, Hanna, to get to be with you.
Thank you. We've already been talking, Julie and I, about our excitement of, both being novelists writing about, very remote places. And so I'm also going to plug Julia's book, Disappearing Earth, if you haven't read it. And you want some more remote fiction.
That's
in
very
your
nice,
life.
but that will be the last time that we do any applauding for me. We're going to do all the applauding for Hanna tonight, because this book really is exquisite. I had the great good luck of getting to read it last year before it was out, and it is my favorite book I read all last year. I've been recommending it nonstop. It is a historical epic. It's an incredible love story. It's this richly detailed and just robust and rich portrait of the human heart. It's incredible, and I'm really glad that it's out and that it's out there, so now we can all discuss it with each other nonstop, which is what I'm looking forward to in 2023. So I wanted to ask Hanna, on this pub day, this very special pub day, your second novel, how are you feeling? How are you doing? How are you?
I feel good because some of my friends in the Arctic Circle, they said, "Be brave, little Hanna."
Are you being brave, little Hanna?
Yeah.
I feel like if one's friends in the Arctic Circle say that to one, then
You
kind of got to do it.
You got to do it. You got to do it.
So I hope you'll indulge me. I already warned you about this question, but I always love to hear writers' thoughts on this. When folks ask you what the end of Drum Time is about, which I imagine they have done a good bit and will do more, how do you answer? Do you have like a one sentence where you sum it up, or a one paragraph?
I would say love versus the forces of religious colonialism.
That's a one phrase, and that's incredible.
It's pretty short, yeah.
That's incredible. Would you mind reading a little bit from Love versus the Forces
of religious colonialism?
Religious colonialism now?
Sure.
So we can get a taste for it?
Yeah. I'll just read from the beginning, just, not too much. But this is the opening chapter. The day of the earthquake was the darkest day of the year. This far north, what counted as day was just twilight stretched thin, so that no shadows fell, and the steeple of the church made no impression on the snow, and the river and forest and hills were all suspended in the same half-finished light. The effect of this was a shared, if unexpressed, uneasiness, but most people were used to it. If given the choice, they would have said, "Let there be darkness," and gone back to their work. That was the sentiment, anyway, around people who had grown up here, Lars Levi among them. He found the cold and the dark invigorating. He was a man of extremes, and so he was drawn to extremes. They suited him. They spurred him on. But even he had to admit the morning was off-kilter somehow. He had dreamed the night before of something of importance, what, he couldn't say, and it troubled him that he might have missed its message. He was a man who put credence in these things and the importance of what was felt, in part because his mother had been that way, and in part because the land made everyone here that way. No one could live beneath the northern lights and the midnight sun and not come out of it sure there was something besides rationality at work, least of all Lars Levi, the pastor of this most northern parish for the past 22 years, a man of some hubris, but not a man who could be accused of insincerity. He was here to preach. He believed in what he spoke, but today he was especially sure of his purpose, and the weight of that purpose made him anxious. He paced up and down the side aisle, inventing little tasks to check on. Had Henrik rung the bell? Had Willa made the fire in the stove? The church was filling up, it really was, the Finns in their usual places toward the front, while behind them were the Laplanders, the Lapps, the Sami, whatever you called them. He used Lapp when he spoke to the Swedes and Sami when he spoke to the Sami. And it occurred to Lars Levi that he was doing it. He had 829 parishioners stretched over 100 miles, and a good quarter of them were here. The Finns had skied for hours along the frozen river, and the Lapps had harnessed their reindeer to the sledges, and they had driven 20, 40 miles through the snow to get here, to a tiny church village in Sweden where 10 of the 40 inhabitants were his own family, to hear him speak, him, Lars Levi Lestadius. But had Henrik rung the bell?
So will you tell us a little bit about how the End of Drum Time came to be? Like what inspired it, what road it traveled before it wound up as a beautiful, gorgeous hardcover in our hands?
Sure. So I grew up in a small Finnish fundamentalist sect that is called Lestadianism. And Lars Levi Lestadius, the minister who appears in these opening pages, was the founder of this particular group. And when I was writing my first book, We Sinners, which takes place in contemporary Midwest, I started doing a little research on it. And I, like many writers do, thought, it looks like there's a grant available.
Oh, I love this.
Right? So I was like, maybe I'll go to Finland. So I went to Finland, and then I thought, I have to justify this grant. So to justify the grant, I met with a professor at the University of Helsinki who was a scholar of this man. And while I met with him for coffee in a church basement, in a mall basement in Helsinki, he said to me, he used this phrase, the end of drum time. And and that was in 2008, I think. And I circled it and I wrote title for a novel.
2008.
Yes. And so that was my first time of realizing there was a much more interesting story behind the founding of this church than I had been told as a child. As a child, it was always you're Finnish. And that was it. That was as simple as it was. And so when there suddenly were reindeer involved, I was like, well, now I have to know more.
That's how I felt when I read the book. As soon as the reindeer showed up, I was like, I'm in for the next 4,000 pages. just I want a whole series of this. It's incredible.
Yeah.
So 2008, but then you were writing your other book, your first book at the time, We Sinners. Mm-hmm. So then what happened from there? Did you sort of back burner the idea? Did you work on both at the same time? Like how did it?
No, I didn't really work on it. It was just an idea in the back of my head, and
it was the title circled in your notebook.
The title, but I've always functioned based on titles.
Yeah, I think functioned very well. Yeah.
So then, when I really sat down to think about it, it really turned out. I realized, well, I need to spend time there. That was what seemed essential, and so my life became: how do I get more grants to go? Who else gives money?
Yes.
And then I realized I needed things like, I need money for a coat, because if I'm going to be hanging out in minus 40 degrees for multiple hours, I need a good coat. And I need someone to fund that coat. Where was I going with this? Now my brain got lost on the coat, which I almost debated wearing up on stage because this.
I wish you had. My brain is also there.
And
so you're looking for funders. You're developing the project.
Yeah, and over the years, I went to Sápmi, which, kind of colloquially most people call Lapland. Mm-hmm. And I went there 6 times. Wow. I went twice for the most amazing residency of my life, where I lived alone in a cabin on the edge of the sea. I did that once in May and then once in December in order to sort of experience, more fully both seasons.
That makes sense to me. Having read the book, it is so rich and so. It starts in 1851, but it feels, I think, more vivid to us readers than like our day-to-day lives do. It feels so sharp and so keenly observed, and I think it's a match of the strength of your writing with the depth of your research. And so I have been so curious about this research process. Like the fact that you were there in both May and December, living on the edge of this frozen sea, makes a lot of sense because it feels really sharp.
Well, I mean, I think even more profound. I mean, the cabin was definitely the real experience with just isolation and solitude, which I also feel like is part of the book. But more important was my relationship with a family there. I developed a friendship that continues to this day, and I went back to see the same family and stay with them, and they took me out to their herds, which is one of the most generous things anyone can ever do for you. If someone says, would you like to come see the herd? You say yes.
It's a big sacrifice for someone to make out of their days, like a lot of time and a lot of generosity.
Oh yeah, because especially, if you're an American, you're useless. What are you? You are literally dead weight. So when you're sitting in the back of their snowmobile, you're just something they have to carry around with them, and then
feed, unfortunately.
And they worry that you're going to get cold because you didn't get a good coat. It always comes down to the coat. Generous is not even the word, really. They taught me how to collect shoe grass and beat it to soften it, to put inside boots, right? I attended a first communion for a relative of theirs that was inside of this church. And my friend's family, they were all in their traditional Sami gakti. But what was playing were hymns that I knew from my childhood, which just like broke my brain. I got to see the Northern Lights while I was lying on my back in a frozen lake, that you name it.
This is so fascinating because you have an extraordinary... I want to ask you about the range and the scope of the story, the different characters you involve, how you bring them all to life equally vividly. But as I hear you talk, I'm like, oh my gosh, Willa, like there you are walking. It feels like one particular character as you talk about your experience. And I was wondering if you could... I'm going to put a tack in the question of the scope of the story and ask you about individual characters. Were there any ones that you felt that the experiences you had were particularly drawn to or inspired by? Or I inverted the parts of that sentence, but do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Any characters you felt were particularly inspired by your experiences, or any characters you particularly identified with? Or because when you read it, they all feel alive in their own unique and similarly vivid ways. And it's so interesting to hear about this experience of coming out of this like Finnish Lutheran upbringing into this particular setting.
Yeah, so in the novel, Willa is the daughter of Lestadius, the minister who appears at the opening. And she falls in love with a Sami reindeer herder. And she sort of tries to incorporate herself into their world and realizes, even though she's from that area and from that land, she's quite useless at first. And in that part, I think, was very much drawn from my own experiences. A lot of the things she has to learn along the way, which way the kettle goes when you're inside the lavvu so you can keep the luck in, that's a really important thing when you're there, but there's no way to know that until someone tells you, right? And I think, one of the experiences always, of course, of being an outsider in any, no matter where you are, is that experience of doing things wrong and really humbling yourself completely and recognizing you're just committing faux pas after faux pas and like, oh no, now you're whistling inside, So I think that part of that particular set of her experiences is probably the closest, the learning.
How interesting. It's incredible. And thinking outside of her character or about her character and beyond, I was so impressed at the range and the scope of the story because it is really quite far-ranging. You have the, Sami reindeer herders, you have this Lutheran minister's family. It spans faiths and cultures and generations, kind of like old people, young people, like all these different experiences, but they also keep these tight and meaningful connections to each other, and the world feels really whole and cohesive and never confusing. And it all feels epic, but never too big or something, like we lose track of it. And I was wondering how you decided on the scale of this story, how you got from Lars Levi to this world and these particular characters in these particular ways.
Sure. So in some ways, I wrote the book over about 10 years, and I drafted it, I don't know how many times, and 5 or 6 full drafts maybe. And one of the reasons I was doing that so often was every draft in some ways was really trying to figure out what is the best way to tell this story, right? I knew I was interested in the history and of this particular church, but I realized, for instance, in an early draft where I tried to just tell it from Willa's perspective, I was like, this is no good. Now we can't see what everyone else sees, right? We have a very limited perspective. Like, Willa is limited as a character. She doesn't know anything about reindeer, right? So she can only know what she doesn't, she can't even know what she doesn't know, right? So that was too small. And it was almost that because that particular spot of the world, because if we all imagine Norway is next to Sweden, which is next to Finland, and then next to that is Russia, right? It wasn't quite like that in 1850, but more or less. And so what you have is a really complex geopolitical confluence. And if you lay on top of that the Sami people, who are more or less the indigenous people of Europe and have occupied the northern part of that stretch, for time immemorial, you get, it's like we might think our relationships to people here are complex, but at least most people speak English, for instance, right? And so there, many of my friends, will speak 3-4 languages at a time because they have to. And so if you're going to go to Sweden to get gas, which is what you do when you live in Finland, you need Swedish, right? You would never get gas in Norway. Norwegians don't get gas in Norway if they can help it. Too expensive.
These are the ins and outs that you need to be there to know. This is like, I think your funders must have been very excited when you came back and you said, don't get gas in Norway.
Or hot dogs at gas stations. Yeah. $14.
Oh my God.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Are they good?
No. I was desperate.
I'm really interested. Okay, so you're working on this for 10 years. We Sinners came out in
2012.
So like 10 and a half years ago. And you were working on this book, you said, it seems like from the moment that was out,
Oh yes.
you started here.
Oh yes.
And I wonder if you could tell us about your journey as an artist during that. I mean, that's a big decade that involves a lot, as you said, a lot of research, a lot of travel, a lot of, I think like the new job of being an author is pretty challenging and demanding and identity shaping in some ways. And I was wondering if you could talk to us about that journey and tell us like what changed in you or in your writing from the first book to the second, or what stayed constant?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing in some ways was the exploration of craft. So when I was describing before in early drafts, I would try it from Willa's perspective, and I would try it, just in a close third, or I would try it in first person. Then when I realized I had more characters, I did an entire draft that was in rotating thirds. So I would but a nice, tight, close third person. But, that felt really limited, right? Then I finally was like, I'll try omniscience, which actually I had tried at the very beginning, right? And so every time I would switch my point of view, then I would begin reading really widely within that point of view. Well, who else is writing in these rotating thirds? And what do I like about that? And would I be aiming for a more continuous flow? Like, do I want a lot of continuity between it? Do I want it to feel more jarring? If you're doing multiple thirds, do you want the voices to be distinct from each other, or do you want it to feel like one person, right? And so in many ways, it's almost like I wrote 5 completely different books, right? 4 of which were never published.
Yeah, it's nice that the 4 that were never published were this book too, because I feel like a lot of us writers have 4 that were never published that are different books than that's its own heartache.
That's true. Yeah.
This is really interesting. Do you feel like the craft education you're getting, it sounds like the craft education you were getting during this time was mostly from the reading and the drafting, like a sort of more kind of like solo focused endeavors. And I'm also curious, or shall I say, but I'm also curious about what you mentioned before about the funding and the fellowships. You have had some incredible communities of artists that you've lived in and worked in during this period too. And I was wondering how that has shaped your project or your self-conception. I feel like stuff like you mentioned, finding the funding to get the coat to send you to the place where you need to wear the coat is integral to the shape of the project, you know, like those practical concerns or where you're living or what you're doing or how you're doing it really means so much to what you produce in the end. And you and I met when you were an artist in residence in Provincetown.
Yes.
And we get to be here because you had this incredible fellowship here.
Yes.
And so it clearly, like, it shaped something. Tell us more.
No, I mean, I feel incredibly fortunate that I have met so many wonderful people, and their work, even if I'm not sort of collaborating actively, you know, it's not like, although I do have a composer friend here in the audience, we're dying to write an opera together. So if anyone is funding for an opera, let me know.
Oh my God, I love that.
Right? Chris Rogerson, look him up. He's great. In any case, you know, I do think that reading their work, they might not be writers, right? They might be another artist here, visual artist, Katie Vita, who actually performed the incredible support, and I don't even know what to call it, of coming with me three times to the Arctic Circle. The first time because I was in some ways afraid to go alone.
Yeah.
And as a visual artist, she was completely up for the challenge. You know, she was there with me recording the sound of reindeer. You know, they make this little clicking, click, you know, and we were both fascinated with that. And I think in some ways experiencing the land with her and with Chris, you know, meant that I got to hear what they heard or see what they see.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's huge.
Yeah.
And not to mention, you know, which here at the Cullman Center, of course, I had access to all of the research, right, of this crazy, huge library. And I mean, that is so cool.
Yeah.
So there's a really famous book on Lapland. And, you know, I was reading a first edition copy of it, from the 1700s. I mean, it was just sitting at my desk.
It's incredible. It's just incredible. I wanted to ask you something, and then it like totally slipped my mind. Because you know why? I'm having reindeer pangs. As you described it, the little clicking and the sounds and the lying on your back, I'm having reindeer pangs in my heart of all of the wonderful noises and things that you've seen. Here's what I wanted to ask you. Are you staggering the next book the same way? I know this is a lot of pressure to you. This is the day your second book came out, and already I'm asking you about the third. But do you anticipate it'll be the sort of thing where you have the title written down 4 years ago, and you're already, you know, percolating and in process on what the next decade will be in your writing?
Oh yes, I've known the title of my next novel for at least, I think 2013. Yeah.
Okay, I want to ask you, but you don't have to.
No, I will. It's called Death Party.
Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm there. This is really exciting.
It has no reindeer in it. I'm sorry to say.
I'm devastated.
I know.
But
I know.
I think whatever you write, we're going to read. So this is really, so you're already sort of artistically, creatively, mentally in that next project, like immersed in it already?
Yes.
That seems ideal.
Yeah.
It seems really great for not getting too caught up.
Yeah, but I do have to say, in some ways, with the book coming out, for instance, the cover is a photo taken by Chris Rogerson from one of our trips there.
Oh my gosh!
And they just removed the snowmobile tracks because you know it's a historical novel, so that would have been weird. But when I see that, I mean, this is my friend's land, and I miss it. I mean, I know I'm going to go back, so I don't have an anxiety of like, will I go back? I'm like, well, obviously I'm going back. But reflecting on it today, I just feel like I'm just one of the luckiest people in the world that I got to spend 10 years. I mean, in some ways you could say, oh, it took you 10 years to write a book. oh, that's, too bad or something. But actually it's a wonderful
10 years.
Yeah, it's a wonderful gift.
Yeah.
To be able to spend that time on it and to really be able to try to get the book right. I wanted so badly to get this right. And I think that was why I kept trying again and again and again. And we haven't yet talked about this that much, but, a huge pressure for me, of course, was the representation of an indigenous people. And I would really agonize, as many of my writing friends and artists, family can attest. Should I be writing this book? Should I not write it? Should I put the Sami point of view in it? Is that a terrible thing to do? Is that a wonderful thing to do? And so that agony, I think in its own way, ultimately did make the book better.
Yeah.
Because I had to try it again and again and again. I remember once expressing a fear to my friend there, one of the world's only female reindeer herders, and she said, "Well, I hope you can tame it."
And she probably knows a thing or two about taming.
Oh, she's wonderful. You should see her separate a herd. It's a thing of beauty. Yeah.
How, when you look at this project now, I know you said it feels like the anxiety and the stress and the trying and the failing and the like made it all the better in the end. And how does it feel anticipating handing this book to your friends and saying, like, here it is, here's the result of the work?
Well, I've already done it.
Nice.
And
what was that like?
Well, it was so beautiful. She sent me a video, and she's holding the book, and then in the backdrop is the same image. Yeah, it was so lovely. And I think that I hired a Sami cultural consultant that I worked with on the book. And one of the things ultimately that she ended up saying, is she said, this book does justice to the injustice of our ancestors. And I just really felt like I need nothing else, Yeah. I mean, relief is not even the word. Yeah. And it doesn't mean that I got it right. It's like, well, that's just one person.
Right.
But there's certainly been, a lot of, both trying and goodwill, of course, right? Not that good intentions produce any kind of good impact, but that's a starting place, right? And more than anything, I feel like I've wanted it so badly to be beautiful for them, for them to feel like the beauty of their land is there and their lives. Yeah.
Of course, you're right. Every person's going to have a different reaction. Like, just one person is just one person. But for one person to say that, it feels like that is sort of the goal as an artist or as a writer, or as like, you want to tell a story so that it feels like it does justice to the person.
Yeah,
who receives it.
Yeah, it's very complicated, right? Because on one hand, I don't want my work to function as any kind of propaganda. Mm-hmm. And I'm not looking to sort of proselytize any particular, agenda. I'm really looking for a kind of truthfulness, right? But part of that truth, like I was saying, like, was getting the beauty and getting the difficulty.
Yes.
Getting, aiming for truthfulness that I can stand behind with a sense of, I don't know, maybe pride's not really le mot juste, but I don't know, with my head, if not high, straight at the horizon. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you hope? I'm going to ask you again to reduce your epic work of art into a sentence, okay? So this fair warning. But do you have, with that in mind, like, as you're looking straight at the horizon, as you're kind of assessing what you've done here, how you feel about it, is there something that you hope that, we're tearing through the pages, we're loving every second of it, we close the last page, what do you hope that readers take away from it? Do you have a vision for what you hope the takeaway is?
Well, of course, because I'm Finnish, I hope they're very sad. No.
All right.
No, I don't know. No, at the heart of it, it is a love story. There's a main love story that sort of that really runs through it. And I think in many ways, it's I was trying to sort of ask, what those boundaries and borders of love are and what it can and can't do. So I think in many ways, I would be quite happy if people left the book thinking about love.
I love that. In the verses, maybe love comes out on top.
Maybe.
Or at least it's still a contender.
Yes.
Okay, this is my last question for you before we move into the audience questions, which I'm extremely excited for, all the things that you have been busily writing down on your index cards, which is, you mentioned that when you were working here, you got to read all these incredible books. We are, of course, in this building full of the greatest literature in the world. Do you have any recommendations for us? Either things for us to check out of the library or things for us to pick up the next time we're at a bookstore, or any reading that you feel like is a must read?
Well, just off the top of my head, I was dismayed to discover last year that I had never read The Transit of Venus by Shirley Hazard until last year. I mean, that's criminal. I don't know why it took me that long. It's just shameful. So she's sadly no longer with us, but just an incredible read. Also written in omniscience, but those sentences you'll just stop in your seat and close the book.
I've also never read it, so okay, I'm running to my Libby Library app right now.
Oh my God, you will not regret it. You will not regret it.
I love this. Are you a part of a cohort at all of 2023 people publishing? Thank you so much. People publishing in 2023. Do you have other new books that you would recommend?
Sugi Ganeshanathan's Brotherless Night just came out, and Paul Harding's This Other Eden just came out. I haven't read This Other Eden quite yet.
It's still early in the year. So.
It's quite early. But I loved Tinkers, which was his first book, so I would be checking that out.
This is wonderful. All right, we've got 3 book recommendations for us. I'm gonna go through. Oh, can you talk about drum time and the meaning for the different characters? So just talking about you mentioned the title before, that this professor gave you the phrase "the end of drum time," but can you talk about, in a way that is no spoilery, what that means?
I'm sorry, was it the naming of the characters?
The naming, the phrase "drum time" and what that means for the different characters.
Oh, so complicated. What a complicated question. The end of drum time is technically a Sami phrase that originated in about the 1700s, possibly earlier. And they were referring to the coming of the missionaries and Christianity and the burning of their drums, and the shamans were also burnt at the stake, and so that became their phrase, and that's where the title originally comes from. And so for the different characters, one of the reasons this book has such a large cast of characters is because I was really interested in trying to look at every sort of potential social facet, right? So I had Willa, who's the daughter of Lars Levi Lestadius, who, by the way, in real life was half Sami, which to me is extremely important detail. He was half Sami and half Swedish. And so her own identity is already bifurcated. Then we get the perspective of Ivar, who's the reindeer herder she falls in love with. And he, is going to, he's very resistant to this new minister. He's very resistant to this church. And we have Riston, and Riston was also in love with Ivar at one point. I know, getting interesting finally.
Interesting. I just want to say, I want to compliment you on Ivar's general beauty and hotness. I think it's very.
Yeah.
I really love a male beauty. And
Yeah,
I think
right.
It's done very, very well.
Yeah. And so Riston, who has also been in love with him, is, also herself a reindeer herder, but the man that she ends up marrying finds himself really drawn to the church. And so one of the things, and then there's a storekeeper who himself is Swedish and knows nothing about the Sami. I mean, he's just like some poor hapless dude who got stuck there and is like, help, why is it so cold? And so one of the things I was trying to do was to sort of portray all of these different ways of seeing. And all these different sort of ways of failing of seeing each other, and also to sort of represent the hierarchy of seeing and not seeing that often happens in any group, where the people who are lower on the ladder tend to know much more about the people who are higher, right? So that was one of the things I was interested in doing. And so I think, for someone like the shopkeeper who's Swedish, he's not even going to know the phrase drum time. It's going to mean absolutely nothing to him, much less the end of drum time. For Ivar, who is actually Sami, the end of drum time is going to be a known thing that's going to be full, I think, of a lot of bitterness, right? A very old way of life that's now gone, or at the time was really on its, was disappearing, and was essentially newly threatened by this minister.
Yeah, it really captures a moment. I know you said your finished desire is to leave us sad at the end of the book, which I have to say, I think the American in you also put like a little optimism in there, a little like dream in there or something. But without a doubt, the scope of the book is the scope of the end of drum time. I mean, like saying here is a moment that is going and is gone. And that adds such poignancy and beauty and urgency to the story.
Yeah, I mean, I think whenever you try to capture a time, especially one that you have not lived in and no one who's alive has lived in, it's quite difficult. And so to me, it really felt like the only way to do that was to sort of escape the solipsism of one point of view and just attempt to do them all. That for better or for worse.
For better. I think for better. Did you, I know you mentioned before thinking about, whether to change the voice for each character. At one point that was a certain kind of question in the draft you were working on. Someone wrote a question about whether to write in 19th century prose, like to capture the voices of the time. How did you kind of navigate the voices and the style from that perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's so tricky when you write period novel. It can be there's a temptation, I think, and some people want to do this. They want it to sound old. In my opinion, anytime you use omniscience, in some ways you're already invoking some age somewhere in that, right? We don't tend to use omniscience as much anymore. As time has gone on, we've moved more and more frequently towards the first person, towards a kind of interiority, of point of view. And so the second you start, jumping around, it's already going to feel old. The rule I used for myself was that I didn't want to use a word that would not have been around at the time. Otherwise, I didn't care. So in terms of the actual prose or the rhythms, I wasn't aiming for old, I was aiming for me. And I didn't really worry about the rest of it. I mean, and from time to time, different readers would flag it and say like, oh, would they really say that word,
What words did they flag?
Oh, I don't remember. No.
People
not
tweeting from there.
Yeah, right. Snapchat. I don't know.
I'm not sure if they would really say that at the time.
Right.
Well, we have two questions actually more about your research. One with your research on the ground there, and one with your research on the ground here. And so one person asked if you could talk just a little bit more about what made reindeer so special and necessary to the book. Your research in the process there, and why that was, as you're writing this story, it sounds like beginning the story from the point of view of like, here's the interesting story behind the founding of this church, how that then connected to or built into the research you did around reindeer herding.
Right. I mean, and it's, there's so many thoughts in my head right now, and I'm trying to
give us all of them.
Right. So, a common phrase in the sort of methodology of decolonization is research is the dirtiest word in the English language, and I feel terrible because I cannot think of the writer's name right. T.Y. Smith, I think. Anyway. In any case, and so one of those questions, when that scholar is making that point, one of the things she's saying is that, when you come into a place, especially as an outsider, and you say, I'm going to understand, I'm going to take this apart, I'm going to go through this piece by piece, and I'm going to read, right? Often in that case, like one of the things you're not doing usually is like eating their food, or trying to like wrestle a reindeer calf to the ground. Pro tip, they're way tougher than they seem. I realized that first part of the research, the being on the ground, so to speak, very early on, it stopped feeling like research at all. I was there to see discrete people who are friends and people that I love and admire and respect. And that's what I was doing there, right? And they came to see me here, and I have to share the story of my female reindeer herder friend who came here, and we took her to the top of the Empire State Building, and she looked down and she said, well, there wouldn't be very much room for the reindeer to run around. And I thought, that's probably the only sort of unique thing anyone has ever said at the top of the Empire State Building. Like, that's it. But that's because she cannot stop, even here, seeing the world through the eyes of reindeer, because reindeer are inextricable from the way of life of Sami who own reindeer. Not all of them herd anymore. I want to be very clear. It's a subsection, and it's becoming more and more difficult to do. And also with climate change, we may right now be in the very last generation or two of reindeer herders at all. And I just got so depressed, I forgot where I was going with that. The research on the ground, right. And so one of the things I learned there was that, from a craft perspective, I've often taught my students, like, plot has to follow character, right? You can't sort of say, here's my narrative, and then kind of jam your character into that storyline, right? The character will really tell you where the story's going. But when I wrote this book, I realized, no. Plot doesn't come from character. Plot comes from reindeer. Because the reindeer drive everything. And so they drive the plot because all decisions around the life there are being made based on reindeer. So you are always deciding, when you're going to eat, what you're going to do the next day. Everything. And so the epigraph of the novel is a common saying there, let the reindeer decide, which is something they say quite casually. So if you're like, well, what are we going to, what about tomorrow? Are we going to go out to the fells, or are we going to let the reindeer decide? Like, how would we know? So I think that, that experience, right, of really learning in a deep way that the reindeer are deciding, was completely essential, right? To not even just like, the feeling of the book, but just the arc and the narrative, in that particular way. And of course the research side of it, the other thing that's interesting about writing a historical novel is who has written our histories, right? And where did they come from? And so, as you might suspect, a lot of the histories from this time are mostly from, Swedish, let's say. I found it was very easy to find, like, a minister's journals or something.
That's our other question, is that, like, sources about maps and histories.
Yeah. So when I was here, for instance, I found like this really interesting listing of like different parishioners in the area, some of who had some names from my own family's history. And so those kind of records, like you can even find out like who got vaccinated for smallpox, like no problem. Like that's no problem to find out if you really want to. Much more difficult to find out the exchange rate for like whiskey to a reindeer pelt. That was really, so a lot of it is sort of who's telling that history, where do you get it from? And so one of the things that happened early on is I realized there was these fascinating journals from these Sami men who had been imprisoned. And when I was at Princeton as a fellow there, I had them translated. So I think being able, and those were really in some ways literally the only Sami voice from that time I could find, which I had to have translated. Otherwise, the Sami people appeared in the fringes, right? They were people being talked about or written about, but almost exclusively, there was no access to any interiority, I think is the essential difference.
It's such a danger, I think, with historical fiction to, of course, like conflate fiction with fact, or to be like, here's this narrative that now is giving us some, like, filling out the historical record. Like, I don't want to I am presuming, I realize, I'm presuming that that's not your goal, because this is a novel and it doesn't do the work that a primary source from that time does. And yet I am so glad that you wrote this novel. Like, I'm so glad that you wrote this novel. I'm so glad that you went to this place and took this picture and printed it so we can hold it and look at it. It's such a beautiful thing that you've done here.
Thank you.
We've come to the end of our index card questions, and so I think we've come to the end of our event. I want to thank you all for being here, and highly, highly, highly recommend this brilliant book and this brilliant person.
Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you.